It is now my pleasure to invite you to the podium, our honored guest, to deliver the commencement address.
Thank you. All right. Father James Marr, Father Joseph Levesque, Dr. John Stranges, trustees, cabinet, faculty, fellow honoree Barbara Layden, graduates, and families. I was surprised very pleasantly when I was asked to speak to the graduating class and to receive this honor. There's the obvious point that I'm a Jewish woman from Canada, and this is a Catholic university in America. But also, I've spent my life working in what is somewhat presumptuously called legacy media. We're not dead yet. So, it's too soon to count the inheritance, but we are, to use the current lexicon, being disrupted. In other words, I'm not quite sure what I have to do to keep my own job and those of my employees, let alone give advice to you. But I have been on both sides of the disruptive equation, both in my professional and personal life, so I have a few thoughts. You know, as a kid, one of the few extracurricular things that I did was to write for the school and youth group papers, and I probably should have known that journalism was the right place for me, but I didn't. I was doing a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies, and I remember that my roommate and I could spend entire afternoons in our apartment in Jerusalem without heat, translating a single page of 17th century Arabic. Luckily, she's British. She was used to cold flats, and she was able to initiate me into the joys of hotties. That's a hot water bottle, by the way. Anyway, it dawned on me eventually that I was never going to be good enough to be able to do original research in an archive in Arabic. But my Hebrew was fluent, and I was able to parlay that into a good first job. Now, here again, my roommate was instrumental. Her boyfriend at the time was the United Press International correspondent in Jerusalem. And as I got to know him, I realized I'd love his job. So he was great, and he introduced me to a very small community of expat journalists, and they gave me advice on how to proceed. And the advice basically was, kid, you have to get an entry job at a wire service. And I was lucky because it was right around the time that the profession was just opening up for women. And if you can believe this, at my final interview, the bureau chief, Frank Crepeau from Ohio, was offering me the job, and this is what he said to me. He said, well, I got the guys together, and I asked them if they thought it would be okay to hire a woman. And we said, yeah, but we'll have to give you cab fare to get home from the night shift. Can you imagine anyone saying such a thing today? But I took the cab fare with thanks. So I worked with this lovely group of guys. Actually, it was a cast of characters worthy of a sitcom. But every time I made a mistake, and that was not that infrequent, somebody would invariably say, I knew we shouldn't have hired a woman. And my usual answer was, don't vilify my entire sex because I screwed up. In other words, I stood up for myself instead of feeling like a victim, but I also took responsibility for my mistakes. That's very important, especially as you begin your careers. One of the most common themes that I see in commencement speeches like this one is, don't be afraid of failing, embrace your failures. But acknowledging your errors as soon as possible will help ensure that a mistake does not turn into a failure. Anyway, I had a sly way of getting a little revenge for those sexist remarks. At that time, virtually all the breaking news came on the radio in rapid-fire Hebrew, and I would be the only person in the office who was able to translate fast enough to beat UPI. That was ultimately the reason that I'd been hired, and part of that credit goes to my parochial school education. So we had absolutely no non-academic subjects to make room for all that Hebrew, and that meant no gym, no home economics for girls, and no shop for the boys, and no typing. So to this day, I cannot type properly. I don't even know if that's still a thing that people learn or if everybody does it the way that I do. But back then it was pretty important. So when a big story was breaking, I was the one who did the dictating, and my boss had to do the typing. It made him crazy. Anyway, fortunately, I did convince them that my mistakes should not reflect on my entire gender. 3 months after I began, they hired a woman photographer. We had many, many adventures together, and we are friends to this day. So my path to that first job was not that uncommon for hyphenated Canadians and Americans who knew their heritage language. You know, basically, you just went back to the difficult part of the world your parents and grandparents fled in order to give you a better life, and you got to start in the news business. Now, these days, that is mostly a terrible idea because anyone who does that is just as likely to get kidnapped and held hostage, and veteran broadcasters hire fixers and bodyguards and not fresh-faced kids. The thing is that you have to be able to find the foothold yourself. You have to understand what you can offer and what may be going on in the company or the industry or the world that will help you get to where you're going. You have to find the opportunity and not expect or wait that it will find you. Now, the big disruptive thing that was happening in journalism at that point was that television was surpassing print as the most important medium. And one of the other little disses I would get if I ever did anything that wasn't totally thorough or hand in something a little superficial, somebody would say, "Oh, you're probably going into television anyway." And that's what I did 2.5 years later. So here's where I have to come clean. In this transition, I come from a place of privilege. My brother Moses is usually described as a media mogul. He's a television innovator. He started the first TV station in Canada with people from different racial and ethnic groups that actually reflected the communities in the city. He not only encouraged but insisted that everyone use their real name and focus on their community. Before that, you'd have been amazed at the number of first-generation Italian or Polish or Greek Canadians with names like Stevens, Roberts, and Smith. Anyway, Moses was a pioneer in many ways. I don't have time to enumerate his accomplishments, and he's been my mentor for my entire life. But I had no problem getting through the door, but after a rough summer, I realized that it would be a lot better for me to work elsewhere, at least for the first part of my career. And I absolutely don't mean to whine about that situation, but I just want to say that everyone has stuff to deal with, even if they appear to be charmed. And if you have to compete with someone who has an advantage because of who they are or who they know, remember that what got you through the door will not keep you there without hard work and talent. I cannot credit hard work or talent for managing to hit the absolute sweet spot of the reach and power of local television. I worked in Montreal, New York City, Minneapolis, eventually returning home to Toronto and doing a stint on Parliament Hill. I had nearly 15 years of experience before I went back to work for my brother as City TV's money specialist, a title, by the way, which my mother found absolutely hilarious. I covered personal finance, labor, and business, and economics, and politics as it related to those things. Now, I was actually world famous in Toronto for a time. And there was one incident that brought that home like nothing else. I was at our provincial legislature, Queen's Park, covering a demonstration by prison guards, and it was turning violent. That was a very shocking thing to see in Ontario. Very unusual, especially since these protesters were civil servants. The first thing I witnessed when I got to the scene was a cabinet minister being spat on. I was just stunned. My camera person and I were moving closer and closer to the action, and the police were starting to put up barriers, and suddenly I saw a cop striding towards me very purposefully. I was sure that he was going to move me back, but instead he said, "Libby, what should I do with my mortgage?" True story. So, when you're fortunate enough to find the sweet spot, make sure that you acknowledge it, be grateful, recognize it. Throughout those years, I always had my eye on the next thing, on advancement. It wasn't until I found myself in a very, very dire situation that I realized how good I had it. 12 years ago, as John said, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. It really wasn't a big shock. My mother had it at a young age, and I always knew that I was at high risk. But until I got that news, I did not know that I carry a gene which predisposes me to a number of different cancers, and which means I could easily get more than one. Doctors found the breast cancer reasonably early, and I went through the treatment without much trouble. Actually, it wasn't that bad. That brush with a deadly disease made me appreciate my life all the more, and I actually got an unexpected career boost. I wrote a column chronicling my treatment in real time for one of our national newspapers, the National Post, and at that time it was very novel because it was just before that type of blogging became very popular and very widespread. So the column was a big hit, and then I wrote a book. And my motivation was not emotional, as many people thought. I wasn't trying to get a catharsis or to work things out. But it was simply that being able to work through my illness made everything better, and also being able to approach my cancer as I would any other subject turned out to be extremely useful. So I had surgery, chemo, and radiation. My readers got to see me bald, and they got to choose which wig I would wear when that happened. And I had a big realization. I realized that being a lifelong blonde was a big mistake, and I became a redhead. 2 years later, the news was a lot worse. I found out that I had the deadliest form of cancer, which is pancreatic cancer. At that time, the survival rate was 5%. Now it is up to 9%. And that means that out of 100 other patients that I would have encountered during my treatment, and believe me, sometimes the waiting room did have 100 people in it, only 5 of us were alive 5 years later. I remember being in the surgeon's office and getting briefed on a very, very difficult life-saving operation. And after I heard all the gory details, I just looked at him and said, "I'm ready, I'm very motivated, I have a great life." And it kind of hit me like a bolt of lightning in the midst of a very difficult time. I have a great life. That had never been so entirely and abundantly clear to me. I try to remember that every single day. So those of you who have done the math have figured that I'm coming up on 10 years since that diagnosis. Obviously, I'm a wildly lucky person. Again, timing played a part. My doctors had just returned from a conference where they had received some new information on the genetic flaw that I carry and its impact on cancers and treatment. And luckily, we could not get the experimental drug that I was very keen on. So they came up with a very innovative treatment, actually using an old drug. And believe me, no one was more surprised than my doctors when it worked. It shrank my tumor. I got life-saving surgery, more chemo and radiation, and here I am. So better yet, they went on to use what they learned to help others. And there's been a lot of research that was launched because of my case. And they've actually made advances, and there's been a change in practice on how to treat cancers caused by the BRCA2 gene. Now, of course, when I was in the midst of this, in the midst of my illness, I had no idea that it would turn out so well. On the contrary. So as I embarked on this very grueling treatment regime, I let go of my dreams for the future. I didn't believe that I'd have the time to see them through or the energy. I was really very sick. And that, ironically, brought me some very great gifts. My thought was that if I don't have a lot of time, I was going to enjoy what I had left as much as possible. And another big realization, I realized that that was basically up to me. When people ask me for advice on how to get through cancer, I tell them to focus on today, to focus on the next thing in their treatment, but not to look too far forward or too far back. And that's essentially a defensive move. But it brought me something that is otherwise very difficult, that I could rarely do before, and that is to live in the moment. And it's something that is increasingly difficult for all of us because we are all busily buried in the device that I'm reading from, and we're focused on the virtual world instead of the real world and the people who are actually present. When I was sick, I came to understand what was important with a clarity that I haven't before, probably since, that what was important, and it was my family, my husband Doug, who is here with me, who took wonderful care of me, and who, by the way, has a doctorate that he had to earn the hard way. The rest of my family, my wonderful friends. Now, when you hear people, especially public people, talk about the importance of their loved ones, it can sound like a platitude. But it's true that in the end, that's what really matters, and it is a gift to realize it before the end and never to lose sight of it. When I finished my treatment and began to realize how incredibly lucky I was, I really wanted to ensure that others would have the same experience, and I wanted to give back. In addition to being the deadliest form of cancer, pancreatic cancer had just about the lowest level of funding and awareness. And that was because there are virtually no survivors to advocate for it. So as a survivor with a media platform, I was in a perfect position to make a difference. I found the only national organization in Canada that was dedicated to pancreatic cancer. It was tiny and entirely run by a couple of volunteers. I got involved, and since I got involved, it has grown into a modern, professional charity that is central to funding research and advancing the cause. Nothing that I have ever done has given me a greater sense of accomplishment. and I've never felt more uniquely qualified to take on a task. So while you're building your families and your careers, get involved with your community. It may end up being the most meaningful work that you do. I know that service is a big part of the mission here at Niagara University. And if you aren't sure what you want to take on, the university can help you, or you can turn to your church. And speaking of churches, I recently found that those messages that are posted on the boards which announce the times of the services have become a thing on the internet. And you don't have to go very far from home to get excellent advice, because the best one that I saw was from Holy Family Parish here in Niagara Falls. And it said, "Never be afraid to try something new. Remember, the Ark was built by amateurs. The Titanic was built by professionals." Thank you.